Kia ora, and welcome to my daily chorus. I'm Bernard Hickey for The Kaka. This is my podcast and video and email newsletter that goes out to paying and free subscribers to The Kaka, which is a Substack about Aotearoa's political economy, particularly around housing, climate and poverty. I wanted to talk today about inflation, which is a hot topic all over again. You might recall that the National Party and its partners in the new government, or not so new government, campaigned for election on the grounds that they would reduce inflation. And certainly the spike in inflation we saw through 2022 and 2023 played a major role in the exit of the then Labour government after 2 terms. And that inflation came from a variety of sources. A big chunk of it came from international commodity prices, and some of it came from domestic businesses, most of which were able to administer prices. So what I'm talking about there is companies that have dominant market positions. That may be a monopoly, a duopoly, or in some cases actually have their prices set for them. There are a bunch of utilities, gas, electricity, and airports where many charges are actually set by the Commerce Commission. And then, of course, we have ones where the government sets the fees and charges, both the central government and the local government. And I want to talk today about how the current government has, despite what it says about wanting to reduce inflation, actually administered an inflation shock to the economy, which the Reserve Bank is now having to react to. So I wanted to show you some charts and detail where we are seeing this administered inflation shock. Now, I wanted to point out a chart which was put into the Reserve Bank's monetary policy statement last month, which showed the makeup of inflation. The blue line you can see there is what it calls administered inflation. So that's government fees and charges. And that inflation was 10.8% in the June quarter from a year ago. That's the highest administered inflation we've had in 35 years. You have to go back to 1990 to see a higher rate of administered inflation. So where's this all coming from? Well, we know that rates inflation, council rates inflation, is 12.2% in the year just gone. But we also know that there's been electricity inflation of 8.4%. Now, that's not included in that blue line, but it's another one on top of that. And we know that there's 6% inflation in landing charges at airports and 6% inflation to student fees at universities and polytechs. Now, this is all part of a broader pattern of the government increasing fees and charges for whatever it can, introducing new fees and charges on the basis of what it calls cost recovery. This really is about the government reducing its budget deficit, reducing its borrowing, with the argument that doing that will reduce inflationary pressure in the economy and allow the Reserve Bank to lower interest rates, which will improve economic growth and employment. The problem is it's having the exact opposite effect, because many of the measures it's taking to reduce its borrowing and reduce its capital investment in the economy are actually increasing prices in this administered sector. And it's something that Reserve Bank has just noticed. And it's an interesting one, which actually raises some really gnarly questions for the Reserve Bank in the way it's structured and how it thinks about inflation. So let's have a look at a particular example that stood out for me in the last few days. So on Thursday night, Greg Foran, the CEO of Air New Zealand, who's heading on out, he was interviewed by Lisa Owen from RNZ Checkpoint, and they talked about Air New Zealand's profit result on Thursday and the costs that it's having to deal with. Foran detailed some of the cost increases, including significant landing charges increases, significant increases in civil aviation fees, and pointed out that if you managed to get a $100 fare between Auckland and Wellington, $62 of that would be various fees and charges from the government and from airports, from administered or monopoly prices. And he says that fares, Air New Zealand fares, will have to rise at least 5% in the coming year to offset some of these costs. Now, what he didn't tell everyone is that fuel costs, a major part of the cost structure for New Zealand, have actually fallen 12% in the last year. Even after that, he's flagging at least 5% cost increases. Now, aside from the issue of, how is it that a company can say that it will increase its prices simply because its costs have increased, when in theory we have a free market where supply and demand determine the prices, is another issue. That's really about our captured economy, why so many parts of our economy, including supermarkets, banking, insurance, retail fuel, aviation, are in fact captured by monopolists or duopolists or quadruplists, alongside the government itself, central and local government. And one of those interesting little fee increases, not so little actually, comes out of civil aviation. So this didn't get a lot of publicity at the time, mainly because it came out on January the 17th. But on January the 17th, civil aviation, which essentially runs the air traffic control towers and charges the airlines for those services, plus security services. So when you go through the gates and have to unload your bags and take off your shoes, that's run by civil aviation. They announced on January 17th they would increase their fees by between 66 and 72%. That's because they've been directed by the government to reduce the so-called subsidy from the government for user pays for civil aviation. Their argument is that they hadn't increased their fees for a while and that the costs had increased substantially since COVID. Regardless, this is designed to save about $70 million and is one of a significant number of fee increases that we've seen in the last 18 months or so. To give you an idea, civil aviation increased its fees by between 66% and 146%. And on top of that, we've seen, of course, car registration fees increased, road user charges increased, passport fees, court fees, visa fees, and visitor fees, and in many cases, doubling or trebling of those fees. And this is part of a pattern we're seeing now where, in essence, a government cost, which is the capital cost, the interest cost on debt, is being converted from a capital cost into a consumer price through user pays. So what we're talking about here is something that currently isn't measured by the Reserve Bank, suddenly turning up as a consumer price inflation item. Now, this is important because the Reserve Bank, when it was set up, ensured that the Consumer Price Index did not include the cost increases that you see when mortgage rates go up. So mortgage interest costs are not included in the Consumer Price Index. You may ask, hang on a minute, isn't that a real cost? Well, it is. But the Reserve Bank was worried that if included mortgage interest costs in the Consumer Price Index, it would create a feedback loop which made it difficult to run monetary policy. So, for example, if you have a burst of inflation and the Reserve Bank puts up interest rates to control inflation, that actually increases inflation even more, because when you see interest rates increase, mortgage costs increase, and many businesses' costs increase. Now, in theory, in a cost-plus environment, that would be passed on in the form of higher prices for consumers. But the Reserve Bank took that out of the Consumer Price Index. It's one of those measures where financial costs and asset prices aren't included in the Consumer Price Index. It means, for example, that the rising implied cost of housing when house prices increase is not included. They are included in other countries. So the issue here is that this is a one-off, perhaps one-off. It's been going for a long time now, and you could argue it was happening under Labor as well. A one-off shift from a capital cost which isn't measured to a consumer cost which is. And this is what I call a capital costs to user pays conversion shock. and it's administered inflation. Now, this is a problem because the Reserve Bank uses monetary policy as a very blunt tool to try to get inflation down. But of course, it's using a tool against something that doesn't react to that tool. So, for example, when the price of butter or fuel or food or fruit goes up, for example, because of weather issues or because the international prices have gone up, those prices will not react to higher interest rates. In fact, they may actually go up even more because farmers and others have higher costs for their interest costs. So, in effect, the Reserve Bank is beating a dead horse when it puts up interest rates when it's trying to control international prices. Also, it's beating a dead horse when it's trying to influence the government and councils when they put up prices. Those councils and governments don't have to worry about a free market and trying to deal with reduced demand. They're doing it for their own reasons. In this case, it's the current government's drive to reduce its deficits and to get the size of government down from around 35% of GDP now, in the wake of COVID, down to about 30% of GDP, and also to bend downwards the debt track from its current measure of net debt, which I'd contest, but anyway, that's what they think it is, of about 42%, and getting it back down towards 30%. So on the face of it, it seems like a sensible thing to do, particularly if you're trying to reduce inflationary pressure in the economy. The trouble is the way they're doing it, by shifting an unmeasured capital cost into a very measured user pays cost, is doing the exact opposite of reducing inflation. It's increasing inflation, as the Reserve Bank is starting to notice. The trouble is the Reserve Bank can't ignore it. Whereas it can ignore higher mortgage interest costs, it can't ignore user pays costs that flow through into higher fees and charges and into other things as well, as we've seen with the price of airfares. Now, this is all starting to have an impact too on the government politically. Over the weekend, we saw from Ipsos New Zealand a new poll, and I've included the chart in the email newsletter, a new poll showing that voters trust Labor more than National on cost of living or inflation issues, and that's because of this latest surge in inflation. And at the moment, most politicians and the public and some of the articles you would have read have blamed it vaguely on higher food price inflation, grocery chains, all sorts of other people. But actually, one of the major causes of inflation right now is this government move to reduce borrowing and debt and shifting those costs onto consumers through user pays and higher charges elsewhere. We're also seeing it through the administered fees and charges in electricity, in gas, and in airports, where the Commerce Commission essentially regulates prices and takes into account increased capital investment and increased interest costs when it does increase those charges. So this is another case where higher interest costs turn into higher inflation, in this case through administered inflation. It's a shock which is proving very problematic for the government. One, it's caused itself. It would argue it's an unintended consequence, but it shouldn't ignore it. And it's a problem for both sides because both sides have used this user pays approach. The problem is also not going away because we know that this user pays approach is really starting to extend out and is going to be expanded through the use of congestion charges, tolling on roads, and other areas where the government thinks that it's better that there are users that pay than the government through its own balance sheet and borrowing and interest costs. I'm Bernard Hickey. That was today's Daily Chorus on an administered inflation shock. It's Monday, September the 1st on the Kaka.